In this episode, we speak with Sean McDevitt, partner at Arthur D. Little, where he leads the USA Time practice, focusing on telecommunications, information technology, media, and electronics. Sean brings nearly 30 years of experience in advising top telecom operators, suppliers, private equity firms, and infrastructure funds on strategic growth, investment due diligence, broadband business services, and market entry across global markets. Sean was recognized as one of the top 25 technology consultants and leaders of 2025. Arthur D. Little is a global consulting firm with more than 135 years of history, known for integrating strategy, technology, and innovation to help clients achieve lasting performance and impact. I'm your host, RJ Lumba. We hope you enjoy the show. If you like the episode, click to follow.
RJ Lumba is the executive chairman of Market Insight Media and managing partner of Growth Cap. He is the host of Top Consultant, a podcast featuring today's best consultants who advise and provide services to corporations, governments, nonprofits, and other organizations. Executives and key decision makers tune in to Top Consultant to identify the most knowledgeable and experienced consultants for their most important projects.
Sean, thank you so much for taking the time to chat. It's great to be with you.
Thank you, RJ. Pleasure to join you as well.
You've had a really interesting career, not only in consulting, but also in management, in executive positions. You know, it's not always that we see kind of consultants that have such an interesting background, which I'm sure helps color how you advise clients. Maybe for the benefit of our audience, if you could take us through your background.
Yeah, sure. You're right. It is a little bit unusual. Often see people that are career consultants, which is certainly a wonderful path for people to take, but mine has been a bit more of a blend. So, in terms of today, right? Today, I'm a partner at Arthur D. Little, global management consulting firm based in Boston, Mass, where I'm responsible for the North American telecommunications, information technology, media, and electronics practice. Our acronym is TIME. Within that sector, my real focus is on wireless infrastructure, such as towers, small cells, et cetera. Also a tremendous amount of work, of course, in the fiber and data center space. And then I have a lot of focus, in particular, with supporting investors, private equity, infrastructure, pension funds, and lenders. And how did I get to where I am today? So a little bit of the history lesson, as you asked for. So as an undergraduate at Brown University, I majored in classics. So it's hard to imagine a world that is much farther away from bits and bytes and telecom infrastructure than the world of Latin and Virgil and, other Roman history. But that is my academic background. I did join a general management consulting firm out of undergrad for a couple of years and then earned my MBA at the Kellogg School of Management at Northwestern University. I had a long stretch of what I would really describe as general management consulting, a couple different boutique firms, broad range of industry experiences, cruise ships, men's hosiery, home improvement retailing, medical devices, all of which kind of seems maybe a little bit odd, but, frankly, I think it was invaluable. Working in multiple industries, different types of strategic, operational, technical issues, the need to come up and learn and come up to speed really quickly on kind of new jargon, information, and concepts was really important. As you correctly point out, I left consulting for almost a 6 to 8 year window where, often you leave consulting and it's welcome to a strategic planning job in a company, which is a great path for many people. But I was fortunate to get an opportunity to work in business development, which was a little bit more, I like to think about it as applied strategy work or as a consultant being responsible for actually creating what you're advising. So I worked for a directory inquiries company in Europe, first looking at business development opportunities across the continent, and then subsequently transitioning to a couple different CEO roles, of course, European context. So it's President Director General, and I worked for 118, 218, or Sandy Suite to Sandy Suite in France, where we achieved the number one market position in a newly deregulated market against a number of the leading French providers, SFR, Pajun, and others. And all of those experiences, I think really build in your career and they combine and merge in your mind in terms of building a skill set that is broader. And, in more direct response to your question, and now that I'm, leading our team, building and growing ADL in the US, obviously it's, storming and forming and building a company culture, creating a recruiting environment, competing with, lots of more well-established firms in the US market for talent. I also serve on the board of directors of the FirstNet Authority, which is a public-private partnership, or PPP, which was the result of recommendations in the 9/11 Commission. And that's between the AT&T and the US government to build and operate a nationwide broadband network for first responders. And it's wonderful, to now be in a position where, some of this regulatory work with the deregulating market in Europe and management work in an operating company combined with the consulting work can kind of come together. And I think, it does provide a different perspective. There are a lot of people in the consulting industry who, may have had small teams reporting to them, maybe even small groups within company, but there's relatively few people who at various times have had, 3,000 to 5,000 direct and indirect reports working for me and during parts of my career. So that I think it does provide a unique perspective.
And we'll get into the details of various things you've mentioned, but before we dive into that, tell me, were you always a good dresser, or did that come from your experience in Europe?
I would say that I am probably one of the least fashionable people you would ever know. I dress more for comfort than anything, but I will take that compliment to the bank. Thank you very much.
So you mentioned that you cover, within the time acronym, a variety of sectors, but you focus on wireless, you focus on data centers,
And
private
fiber.
equity pensions. Curious about a couple of those. Data
Yeah.
centers, I mean, that is an expanding area on many different levels, from the components and chips all the way to the real estate, et cetera. Can you tell us a little bit about what you do with data center companies?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a broad range of activities. So, in the data center world, there's kind of two elements of it. There's building and constructing a data center and, filling it with tenants. And then there's also the investment side. And when data centers are up and functioning, there's a concept called a yield co, which is you kind of sell off a stabilized asset. So we work across that chain. We do a lot of work on the development of data centers. So a number of financial players that we have worked for who are investing in data center platforms, more often than not multi-city, often co-location. The days of us having a closet in most of our companies, which had our email servers and our files being stored, are gone. At my firm, that old closet now has umbrellas and baseball hats and sweatshirts in it, really, and everything has been put into the cloud. And that data and those compute capabilities require secure environments. They require powered buildings with appropriate cooling. So there's a lot of work in terms of understanding the market opportunity there, where to build, the costs of doing that. So there's been a lot of work for the financial community investing on the equity side in those, and then also quite a bit for the lenders. It's in many ways a real estate asset, but it's a real estate asset that blurs, the use of that real estate asset is not people or companies selling bottles of water or clothing. That powered shell of a building is fundamentally there to house compute. So there's a tremendous amount of electronics, semiconductor, et cetera, as you say, that goes into it. So we've really worked with people to understand, the business case there. What are the capital expenditures likely to look like? What do the cash flows look like in a business like that? And so there's been a lot of work in that area. Now, as you correctly point out, with the advent of increasingly higher compute requirements, and AI is obviously the one that's most foremost in people's minds and is driving a lot of change. But it's important to understand it's not just AI. There are a lot of other high compute, high intensity applications that are out there already and that are emerging, never mind when we get to things like quantum. So the scale and size of these facilities, they're becoming increasingly larger. They're multi-building complexes stretching over hundreds, if not now thousands of acres. The days of working on a data center that was, 50 megawatts has become 200, 300, 500 megawatts. And, we're currently working right now on a couple different data centers that are well above 1 gigawatt of capacity, which, a very short time ago would have been just hard to even imagine. but it has been an explosive part of the industry. And it's one that continues to see significant um, supply constraints relative to demand.
Yeah, I was fascinated. I was driving my daughter to a soccer tournament in the Dulles Tech corridor. I mean, it was like one data center after the other right along. And I was thinking to myself, well, this isn't that secure. And then you hear about these other parts of Virginia, like I think close to Charlottesville, where they're tapping into maybe underutilized nuclear power down there. So it's just fascinating, everything that's happening with data centers. Now, moving on, pensions. What
Yeah.
what kind of work do you do with pensions?
Well, I mean, pension funds typically are just a different type of investor, right? Typically a longer term investor. They're not looking for, let's say 5 to 7 year returns in, the high teens, like a traditional private equity player might be looking at. A pension fund is typically a very long-term investor. We're talking about, a mentality around generational wealth, really, and kind of a caretaker mentality for people's ongoing pension funds and monies, and in many cases, aspects of sovereign wealth. So, I think the work with the pension funds that we do really doesn't look much different than other investors. They are looking to understand emerging trends, understand underlying economics of a business, understand the competitive environment, and take a look at kind of returns and cash flows. The difference there is, they would have an appetite and a willingness to invest in certain types of assets that, in some ways, maybe they're a little bit less sexy than some things than certainly a venture capital firm and even a PE firm would look at. So a little bit more, what I'd call traditional infrastructure. Pension funds were always very big in, airports, roads, water, power. I think as the telecom industry has matured and become fundamentally integrated in every industry globally, things like towers are viewed kind of as infrastructure, just like water power was, and fiber and data center assets, which have a very long life and are, maybe they're not quite another utility between, heat and water and light in your house. They're maybe not the fourth utility, but it's pretty close. So we've seen the appetite of pension funds for the technology space, digital infrastructure space grow pretty rapidly. But really, I don't think the questions they ask are any different. I just think their expectations for return and their horizons are quite different. So there are certain types of investments a pension fund wouldn't look at, but conversely, there are certain investments which really are much more tailor-made for a pension fund versus a VC or a private equity investor who's looking for a different level of risk and therefore a different level of return.
Hmm. Notice something super interesting in your background in how you've been involved with hockey. I was just recently texting with a friend of mine who was a professional athlete, and we were talking about how it plays into like what you learn as an athlete, the discipline, the going through hardship, how that plays into being a successful person in business. Could
Yeah.
you share maybe some insights you've gleaned from having been through a hockey career, so to speak?
Yeah, you really highlighted, some of the core elements of it, to be honest. I always loved hockey. I grew up in New England area and grew up at the time when Bobby Orr and the Big Bad Bruins were the team in town. That was my kind of 4 to 8 year old self. So like nearly everyone in the Boston area started playing hockey then. I wasn't particularly good, to be frank. I was, average at best on second or third level teams, even at a town level of hockey, but really loved the game and played up through high school. Did it for the enjoyment, right? And did it because I liked the sport. By the time I got to high school, track was clearly a better place for me to spend my time, both from a talent and achievement perspective, and ultimately did get, recruited to run in college as well. So it was a smart decision. But, then once in college, started playing club hockey again. In business school, played club hockey, put the gear away probably for a few years. And then I think my wife was kind of, you need to go out and do something and be with some other guys and do some stuff that's, better exercise. So she pushed me to kind of get back into men's league hockey, which I did. And then, yeah, of course, children have a tremendous influence in your life. Two of my three children played hockey, so that dragged me into coaching. And then when my youngest wanted to start to referee and be an official, I started to do that. So, despite being, let's just politely say, a not very good youth player, and certainly not good enough to play at any decent high school varsity level in the New England area anyway, after a long journey, picked up officiating. And, bizarrely, if there's any great success, quote unquote, in the hockey sphere, it's come much, much, much later in life. I started refereeing, then started doing a lot of sled hockey, which, if you don't know, is a Paralympic sport where folks with disabilities, whether they're amputees or double amputees, and in many cases, depending on the team, 30% probably on average are veterans who've suffered, catastrophic lower body injuries. Started to referee that sport, became a standing league referee for the Northeast Sled Hockey League, which actually goes, believe it or not, from Montreal all the way down to Florida, and have continued to do that and been active with USA Hockey in the sled community. And I've now refereed the past 3 years of USA Hockey National Championships, and last fall was in Dallas to referee the NHL Sled Hockey Classic. So, if there's lessons there, I don't know, there's maybe many of them, which is, first, do things that you enjoy. Maybe they ebb and flow over your life, whether that's music or theater or social activism. Those things somehow end up being really deeply ingrained in you. So kind of don't let go of them. And, I guess it's never too late. At no scenario on earth would I have ever anticipated that deciding not to even bother to try out for hockey in high school, because I probably wouldn't make the team. And that you fast forward many decades and I'd be officiating national championships. So it's been a wonderful ride. It's a wonderful sport. USA Hockey is very committed to adaptive sports. There's blind, there's deaf, there's special, there's warrior, there's standing amputee, and there's sled hockey, 5 different disciplines of adaptive sport. So it's really wonderful to see that there's a home and a place for everybody, depending on their different abilities.
Excellent. We touched on leadership, but I'd like to go further into that because you are leading a sizable team there. And maybe if you could share with us a little bit about your philosophy about how you lead, and then would like to hear a couple insights on what you look for when you recruit to your team.
Yeah, there's troves of literature out there in the business world around leadership and certainly lessons from, military, sports, business, public sector, go down the list of ways to think about it. To me, leadership is a consistent application of a philosophy of believing in your team, empowering your team, and having a bit more servant and support leadership. There are a lot of people I think who think leadership is you stand up, you make a big speech, you make a big pronouncement, you write some wonderful memo, and all of those things have a role. They're a tool in your toolkit, but it's really the day-to-day consistency and application of basic principles that I think is the hallmark of it. I mean, the analogy that I do like that I've seen others use, I won't take credit for it, is it's like brushing your teeth, right? You have to brush your teeth 2 minutes every day, at least once, preferably twice, to make sure your teeth are shiny and you look handsome or pretty or whatever the adjective is you like. You can't skip it for 6 months and then brush for a couple hours and make up for it. And I think leadership's the same way. Your team members, remember that you helped them with X. You stayed late, to support them. You didn't do what we often see managers do, which is kind of this seagull style of management. They fly in on a Friday afternoon, they poop all over everything and they fly away. I think it's your responsibility if you're a leader of a team to do the work with them and to understand what they're doing. And, in many cases, lead by example, but lead by partnership with them. So for me, I think that's what I try to do. I'm certainly not perfect at it. I have a lengthy list of shortcomings that I'm sure others could give you chapter and verse on, but certainly, that's the way I try to think about things.
That's amazing. And then what do you look for in candidates?
I will tell you that the most important things I think are, look, there's an innate level of intelligence and smarts that is required. But to be frank, most people have that. As complicated as some of the math is that you can do in business, the fact of the matter is that so much of it is ratios and decimals. Some of the core math you use and more often is stuff you learned in fifth grade. So, the base level of skills is almost a given. It's almost table stakes. I think the number of people you can find who have that is a very large number. So to me, what I think is much more important is, a demonstrated record of commitment to excellence, whatever that is, right? It could be level of effort in a sport. You row crew, that's a 20, 30, 40 hour a week commitment if you do that in college. It could be social activism. It could be volunteering activity. It could be academic. It could be the level of work you do in a lab or you do on research projects. But I look for a kind of consistent level of excellence. I also look for an ability to learn and be coached. Inevitably, as you get older in life, you probably get less and less coaching, which I think is unfortunate. The fact of the matter is you can learn from almost everybody. And I think people who are open and self-aware and want to learn, I think that's a critical skill. I think it's important for people to understand no matter how smart you are, there is somebody smarter than you. If you're a really brilliant mathematician, there may be somebody who's just smarter than you at plumbing or at being an electrician or public safety or computer programming. And so I look really for, a base level of smarts, but that's easy. A demonstrated record of commitment and excellence is the second thing. And then the third thing is really coachability and ability to want to learn and grow. To me, those are the cornerstone things. For example, I don't care what people major in, and people often find that a bizarre statement to make, and I will state it unequivocally. It is not possible for me to care less what someone majors in. You can have someone who's an art major or an art history major who has all the quantitative and analytical capabilities that are required. They're just chose in college to pursue art or art history as their area or field because it was a passion and something they loved. And their excellence, their willingness to learn, and their raw smarts, that's going to give them more success. I frankly think it's a delusion that majoring in something makes you an expert. It doesn't. If you do the math, 4 years of college, 2 semesters a year, 4 classes a semester, classes meet 3 times a week for, I don't know, pick a number, 4 to 5 hours a week of classwork. And you take, I don't know, maybe 10 of your 32 classes in college as a major. When you do the math, if you work, for me or any other firm for that matter, within a period of 2 to 3 months, you have spent more time in a focused area than you did in 4 years as an undergraduate. So to me, the ability to learn because you have smarts, you are inquisitive, and you commit to achieving excellence, and you're, self-aware and willing to be open for coaching and growth. Now, those are the cornerstone things. And I really believe that you can find that at the top of nearly any university and certainly in any major that's out there.
Last two questions. One
Sure.
is, can you tell us about a person who has had a profound influence on you?
My goodness. There's obviously personally, a great many people. Obviously, my mom, my wife, my children, my brother, but I'll focus it more professionally, which is, I suspect, where you go. I think that almost every significant boss I've had, again, not on a given project or not for a short time, but, someone who I've worked with for, kind of 2, 3 years, let's say at a stretch, has really had a lot of profound effect. I've worked for some very difficult people, frankly, some very unpleasant people, and I've worked for some people that are wonderful. And I think there's actually things to learn from each of them. In some cases, you learn things like, I don't want to ever be treated like that again, or I don't want to treat other people like that. And, that may be born out of a negative experience, but I think you can internalize that and make it something positive. There are also other behaviors to emulate where, you see transparency and openness and integrity and a belief in kind of that consistent application of leadership that I talked about earlier, which is admirable. So, what I've tried to do is be a bit more of a sponge. And, I certainly have never patterned myself on anyone else, in part because I think that is not authentic. You're kind of playing a part on TV rather than bringing your authentic self to what you do. But what I have tried to do is learn from different people, adapt to the good, avoid the bad, and try to treat people with respect and learn and grow. And I think that kind of lifelong learning mentality and taking that to, people that I've interacted with is a cornerstone of how I've been influenced and frankly, hopefully how I influence others.
Last question. Can you tell us about a charity cause or other endeavor that you're passionate about?
Oh, we talked about hockey. I'm going to stick with sled hockey. Sorry to keep on that. But I think one of the things that is important to recognize in life is that, there are misfortunes that befall lots of people and great things and wonderful things that happen to other people. And we all like to think that it's, bad luck or good luck or skill or whatever. But life just happens. And, there are a lot of people who were young children who, had an accident and have a physical disability, or folks that served as either first responders or in military service who've had tragic things happen. And, those are physical constraints and physical challenges that those people have to overcome. And in, nearly all cases, there's nothing wrong between the ears of those people. They're still the same human being they were before. And, what I really love about sled hockey, and I've reffed youth hockey, high school hockey, college hockey, and sled hockey. And by far, I prefer sled and para. The athletes are as intensely competitive as any other athlete. They will chirp and yell at you as a ref if you miss a call. But, you are just doing another sport with, talented people who are committed to their jobs, their families, their wives, husbands, spouses, partners, just like anybody else. And, it can be discombobulating to walk into a rink and see blades and sleds and wheelchairs and other forms of prosthetics everywhere. And I guess for some people it may be disconcerting, but when you get on the ice, it's all that goes away. It's just hockey, and those folks can move as fast or faster than you and I can. And it's wonderful to be part of that. So if anyone hasn't seen a sled or Paralympic hockey game, video it, search YouTube, search whatever. You'll be really stunned to see the tremendous level of athleticism that exists.
It's a wonderful note to end on. Sean, thank you again for taking the time. It's been a true pleasure.
Thank you so much. I appreciate your time, and thanks.